Hello everyone, today we talk about the Justinianean Limitanei. So this is an interesting topic because in the 6th century Roman Empire, the Limitanei were substantially instituted, more or less formally. In the 4th century, by the so-called Constantinian reforms, had somewhat changed, both in their strategical and tactical employment, maybe not so much, but organizationally speaking, that had been substantial modifications. So you know that the Limitanei, also known as Milites Castellani, Castriciani, or also Riparienses Castriciani, if they were deployed along the river frontier, were substantially the border army corps, and their name came in fact from the limes. So, at least what we use to define the more properly in the way we tend to look at this strategical function, geographically speaking, the fortified province of frontier. I say this because actually the Romans didn't use the term limes as we do, right? The idea of a border is something much more, it was more like a frontier proper, like that's the concept. The Limitanei would form the monumentum that would essentially control, yes, a line, but that is not necessary to be conceived as a border proper, right? But it's just, a stationary troop that was, or even this included even fortifications at one point that, in the concept, of the term, that had to guard wherever it was around, right? They had this deterrent factor. Naturally, the Limitanei are the closest that it resembles, especially in after the Constantinian reforms, to an actual frontier guard, right? And we will see now that they had evolved in different directions, depending sometimes even on the same province, because there were certain borders that were definitely much more messed up. Others that were substantially more pacified, more let's say more quiet. And you see in there that the Limitanei forces had changed. Sometimes they were like police more than the army. In certain cases, instead, they became effectively army, even something professional, so much as we will see now that they would be called Pseudocomitatenses, that is essentially a quasi professional force of the field army, right? But also here with the terminology we have to be careful, because what's a professional force anyway, especially in the 6th century, when we talk about the Limitanei specifically, it's not that evident, because the Constantinian reforms had started from the idea that there was a substantially professional character of the same Limitanei, were simply troops who were stationed there. But it's obvious that over time these units had somewhat settled down and even gentrified and started doing something else, not just the soldiers, right? This is typical of late antique times. So if we look, and when we talk especially about Justinian times, the Limitanei are better documented, also because they were more active and more present in this regard, chiefly on the eastern frontier proper with Persia, right? The Justinian reconquest of the West had surely brought to the creation of Limitanei forces in Spain, in Italy, even though we don't have quite a direct evidence of that. The Danubian frontier was controlled in the same ways, but let's say that the Persian frontier being the hottest one, so the major employment and also a modification of the figure of the Limitanei as military units. So if we look, for example, at the Persian War of Anastasius, well, we see here the employment of the Limitanei at the beginning of the 6th century, and we observe fundamentally contingents that were drawn from the districts of Mesopotamia, Osroene, and Armenia, that participated to the campaign, being committed though in clashes on a smaller scale usually, which basically demonstrates the fundamental continuity in the importance of their typical strategical function, at least for what is in such contexts of frontier. And from the sources we seem to deduce, but it's not clear, that the local commanders, the duces, used principally mounted contingents on a regular base, which kind of makes sense. This is a characteristic that you can observe in many police services also, not just within the Roman Empire, but for example in the Romano-Germanic kingdoms. And when we look at the 6th century, we made some video discussing this. We observed that pretty much everywhere cavalry essentially increased in importance in a way or another, right? On Schwerpunkt we have concentrated somewhat more on a kind of more narrow Western European perspective, where you see that fundamentally the major influence came from the steppes. But if you look at the Mediterranean, North Africa and Asia, you see that it was like that everywhere, that basically the standard military culture of the time saw the consistent improvement or even implementation, considering that there were peoples that were typically, very skilled on horseback. Thinking about the Maori in North Africa, right, since centuries, of mounted warfare proper. And it's obvious that on a frontier, especially in a period called migration era, having a mounted contingent can make a substantial difference. You can't patrol more easily, cover the spaces, covering them in less time, but also dealing with peoples that make extensive use of mounted troops, right? If you look at there were peoples, for example, here looking at the eastern frontier, you look at the Persians, definitely were like that. But even the Arabs, that traditionally were mostly like infantry, especially in the core lands of Arabia, actually, were first of all Romanized in part, so they also made extensive use of cavalry in several occasions, but in fact had to cope with other connationals outside of the imperial borders that were, caravan raiders. That is kind of the most typical picture you have in mind. So we're not talking necessarily about entire masses of peoples, right? We made that video, for example, about the Battle of Mammes, when you see that the Maori have this pretty substantial amount of cavalry at that point, and of camels that were ironically introduced by the Romans, right? But most of frontier warfare, even in there, was really about tiny, contingents. So much that, especially in Africa, from that regard, the Romans had not built, massive series of fortifications. Sometimes a fence and a ditch was enough to not necessarily to stop these people, but oblige them fundamentally to break it at one point and to have necessarily to go back there, and they were easily trappable, we can say. And we should talk, in fact, also in terms of military potential and what the Limitanei in this sense were involved in. For example, if you look at other frontiers, always Africa is a good example. When Justinian Belisarius, on behalf of Justinian, reconquers Africa, you see the Vandals that were defeated and in part were, killed, in part deported and integrated in the Roman military. But many of them actually remained in Africa, especially in the western part of the province, settled in those military colonies that the same Vandals had used, probably in turn under the previous, in the same ways that the Roman military administration had organized the local defense to in fact fight against the Moors. And we do know that the Vandals had, by the way, gotten in part influenced, aside from their originary military traditions that probably saw use of cavalry coming from most of the Eastern Germanic branch in general, right? These are just approximations, but we know it was the case. This cavalry influence, the same goes for the stationary troops of Federati, the same goes with the Gothic War, when the Byzantines reconquer Italy, and in the north, in the Po Valley, in certain areas, especially of the northeast, were less populated, etc., there were local colonies of Goths that had a primarily military character, especially because the area wasn't quite stable in general, especially from the eastern side, and they were simply left there and becoming border guards of the Romans that eventually, however, joined the Longobards when they invaded the peninsula from that channel. But this was done all the time, and therefore we also have to stay relatively open about what the Limitanei fundamentally were, because they did correspond to a previous military style administration. So these were technically Romans, but you're talking in a time which even demographic resources are very, very rare, and they will become even more so later on. So everybody at this point would try to fill the gaps of the ranks and to settle entire communities, sometimes not just of military men, in a place just to defend it. Right. This will particularly even, especially after the Islamic invasions, where even the great land estates were when destroyed in many areas, like the cities declined, and therefore it was easier to create on the thematic base these local peasant farmer soldiers, let's put it in this way, that constituted the provincial army, right? Rather than having someone who paid through this massive land-owned resources, all the equipment, all the organization that eventually the state had to employ to maintain permanent professional troops. Right, this thing is already being surpassed progressively. We will see it, in fact, with the same loss of importance of the Limitanei at one point, exactly during Justinian times. So, not even the ones of the biggest crisis proper. So, and everything happened very gradually, right? Consider that in Justinian times, also the army organization was not so orderly after all, right? Sometimes you find all these older units that are mixed with, I don't know, foreign troops or other local levies, right? Everything was mixed just to have something functional, to have men in the first place, right? And armies were in fact very large because they lacked effectively the men and the other resources to maintain them. And for this very reason, the quality and the technical characteristics of the Limitanei in the second half of the 5th and in the 6th century are still today a matter of debate. We still, apparently observe a certain continuity relatively to the temporaneous interchange between the Comitatenses army, so the mobile armies, right, and the border forces. And this practice that is already witnessed during the 4th century, for example, in moments such as the aggregation of the Limitanei of the Osroene to the Persian expedition of Julian II, that was maintained throughout all the 5th century. For example, with the participation of troops that were drawn from those border districts of Egypt, Thebais and Cyrenaica, to the expedition against the Vandals in 468. And it was generally one direction flux directed from the frontiers towards the center, in the sense that here there was the exceptional, not so frequent after all, concentration of troops, of Limitanei, as a matter of fact, around the armies built through the mobile, to the Comitatenses troops, right? So these were usually prepared in a certain area of the empire, and therefore, paradoxically, even if they had to operate in certain frontier, there were other troops coming from the rest of the frontiers to join them, right, and to back their numbers. So here we shouldn't think of the difference. I mean, this is more easily understandable if you think at the Comitatenses and Limitanei troops as not so categorically separated, especially from a tactical point of view, right? There is this prejudice that, you know, every Comitatenses unit was somewhat equipped in a certain way, better, you know, heavily armored and better provided, more professional. And the Limitanei were just, you know, a sort of local militia, more poorly equipped and trained. But it's actually false. Like, very often we can't see how the two kinds overlapped. Like, certain Limitanei troops were actually even elite troops, right? And we have to understand it on the base of the actual necessities that these border districts had in maintaining effective forces that had to deal by themselves with military threats that required definitely a tactical completion, we can say, because sometimes the mobile army wouldn't even intervene and wouldn't even have the time. So you needed heavy troops, you needed drilled, well-equipped, well-trained troops. I mean, you really you could really see all the varieties of troops among the Limitanei, but by all standards. And sometimes, so the leitmotif of this video is that progressively, however, there'd been a sort of shift for which the Limitanei districts had been, during the 4th, 5th, 6th century, progressively, gradually depleted of their best military assets, meaning that it is true that at a local level there is as a trend, a general increase in the, you know, impoverishment, for example, of the Limitanei, and the transformation into something else, in local peasantry rather than peasant militia rather than professionals. But this happened also during, in fact, the organic integration of Limitanei units in the Comitatenses army for forever, basically, so that these units would be drawn temporarily from a border district. They would join the Comitatenses army. They would remain with them because maybe the campaign was very long. So these people also became veterans in some form, so were considered as elite troops by certain standards. So they were maintaining the organic, right? And this all happened without, largely probably without any, you know, pre-planning, right, about it. And sometimes you can track it pretty easily, because some of these units got the official title of Pseudocomitatenses, right? So you maybe in practice they were the same thing, right? Even if you could expect them to have been on average of a slightly lower level, but at one point these were just names of the units. They even maintained the status, not necessarily from even an administrative point of view. What did that mean in the first place, right? Always remember here that there is a progressive increase even in the you know, the dependency of armies on a local base. Even the imperial, even the mobile armies, right? Even those that depended on the finest sources of supply of the system. So there is an increased territorialization of the armies that here, you know, we're talking about Justinian times. So yeah, lots of units made back and forth. There was a lot of blending, but that's exactly the point. Most of the resources that these troops needed were found locally, and therefore even their organic structure depended on the local resources rather than the broader system. We know that there is a decline even in for example, the monetary use in the pay, that there is an increase in natural goods as a form of retribution. There is an increase actually of private units, right? Think about the bucellari even, right? So it's very, very complex, and at the same time always think about a lot of foreign troops actually joining from literally everywhere. I mean, it could be Huns, Maori, Longobards and Arabs, like literally everything here, and they all fought basically together, preferably maintaining their tactical specialties if they were, especially people coming straight from the spring of that their peculiar ethnic military culture, but still eventually and progressively integrated in the Roman army proper. However, in the second half of the 5th and even more in the initial phase of the 6th century, there seems to be an increase in importance of a different trend, at least in the most critical frontier sectors. So from one side, seemingly, the intensification of the permanent deployment of units drawn from the provincial Comitatenses armies in cities that were next to the frontier, especially in the east, such as the mobile detachment deployed in Palmyra in order to back the local Limitanei. But it's especially meaningful the fact that this form of cooperation with the Limitanei was extended also to the presentales contingents. That is a practice that was even formalized from a legislative point of view during the reign of Anastasius I. Now, this is very powerful, right? Because against the habitual practice that had occurred ever since, not even the Limitanei had been formed. Like you can see even from the Vexillationes of the 3rd century, that all these frontier troops were at one point drawn to support the mobile army, right? But here you find something very different. You find detachments of the mobile armies that are deployed locally, right? Hence that territorialization we were talking about before, to back the local frontiers that in this regard actually from a strategical point of view evidently have a substantial and important function, right? Because if okay, from one side you can see there was a failure of the Limitanei proper, but also there is the idea that you can't stem from the frontier proper certain threats, right, that have not necessarily an overwhelming impact. Like there will be major Persian invasions at this point that will require large parts of the entire imperial army to cope with. But here we're talking about the necessity, evidently, of the army to territorialize, to localize at one point to meet with local threats. So as a permanent garrison, if you want. So here you have even a Comitatenses unit basically substituting or backing in practice, but the two things are, blurred, the Limitanei force. But even the presentales troops are definitely fascinating. Presentales were the Palatine troops, right? So here you realize that the empire was recognizing the necessity of a stricter coordination between even the imperial troops, like the best troops of the empire, for the defense of the frontier. Now, in the Justinianean Code, it's mentioned further the right to access from the side of the Duces Limitanei to contingents that were detached from the presentales units. What does this mean? Well, the thing can be interpreted in different ways, right? From one side, you can observe, you could theorize an increase in the cooperation between the different categories of troops in general, right? From the other side, as a new policy of reinforcement through mobile contingents at a local level in the frontier districts that were not adequately protected, right? And from the sources, we don't really understand here what the conclusion is. It's, however, possible that there were naturally different territorial and chronological contexts that varied, right, in a non-uniform way, and therefore you have to study sector by sector to understand what was going on, right? Procopius, for example, remembers the deprivation from the side of Justinian of the border defense on the Eastern Front in 532, after the declaration of the eternal peace with the Persians, that was all but eternal, evenly, as if to stress the uselessness of a permanent tool of that type in peacetime. This is important because effectively, when you look at the territorial control of the empire, here it's hard to spot a proper frontier, right? Even just from a of course these frontiers usually followed geographical borders, etc. There were some infrastructures ever, but at the same time, what really matters politically and strategically at this point in order to control the territory is more deterrent posed by the availability of troops, their and their training, their military quality overall, to detach in various directions. As we were saying before, resources were running out, so you don't find here even the sense in maintaining troops that you can and must use on a different frontier in an area that, maybe you need to defend, but after all will remain maybe loyal to you, or even in the case of enemy invasion, you will have to shift, you have to respond to by shifting the army once again there. So the actual necessity of having functional professional forces at a local level seems to vanish in some ways. For example, still in the Justinian Code, it's witnessed the creation from the side of Saint Justinian in 534 of border forces in the reconquered Africa, but it was subjected to chronicle Berber incursions that, at least in that sector, for example, makes us suggest the existence of an unchanged trust, at least in line of principle, on the system based on the frontier district. What does this mean? It means that obviously Africa was a mess, right? There is a bitter criticism, I don't know how much founded on the idea that Byzantine should have not reconquered. Well, actually we discussed it extensively, made at least 4 videos about that. How the Justinian reconquest was actually a necessary, a useful thing, right? I am actually very positive about it because it's very easy. No, everything crumbled at the end, so it was wrong to do so. No, well, you can't really say that. It's like asking if you foresaw coronavirus happening now. So did someone, right? Was politics today in our civilized world better than in the 6th century? It doesn't seem so. Well, at the same time, happened there the same thing, even worse proportionally. So to criticize Justinian to do something that actually served a pretty meaningful and concrete purpose, can be easily observed, is to it's difficult to back in this regard. But anyway, we discussed it in those videos. So these are examples that show you how different frontiers could be fundamentally managed in different ways. Right? It's that simple. These examples are actually very, very meaningful. And I was saying that the African frontier was pretty troubled. Like the Berber invasions were quite, pervasive, right? So it costed a lot also to maintain Africa afterwards. However, what could you do at that point, right? At least, you see on the Persian border, at least you had this diplomatic insurance that for a while things would go well on that frontier. You had a major power. This is another very important thing, is that the Berbers were all scattered tribes, so you couldn't control them individually, right? And this is the same strategy the Byzantines used, for example, on the Illyrian frontier. It was much better to, for example, consolidate the monarchies of certain Germanic groups than leaving them all divided and scattered. So there were peoples that were kind of responsive to that. The Germans were a bit halfway, but the Berbers, for example, they didn't simply care. Like, they were semi-nomadic people. They didn't give a damn about what the empire wanted, just wanted to raid, because that was their lifestyle, right? For incipient monarchies like the Germanic and the Longobard or the Japid ones, it was fine to actually enter in the orbit of the empire, to share the benefits as elites, to consolidate a centralized power. In the case of the Sasanians, well, that was a pretty good solid empire, right? And therefore it was peace. Yeah, that could be broken at one point, but at least you knew that you know that in some measure at least that frontier would remain temporarily quiet, right? In Africa, even if it wasn't like that. So it kind of makes sense. And to me, all these choices seem actually to prove that these people at the time knew pretty well what they were doing, and they made pretty sensed things in the first place, right? So to pretend that we would have had a better way of doing it is a bit, debatable, to say the least. Other contemporary witnesses relative to the Limitanei led us, however, more than just one doubt on the status of the same within the armed forces proper, right? And as we were saying before, from this we can suppose that the role of the Limitanei was tending, at least in general, to become that of a sort of frontier police rather than an integral part of the army. The Justinian Code lists all the mentions of the Limitanei in Justinianean times, limiting them to police operations in order to unload the Comitatenses from such incumbencies, and in time of enemy offensives to the pure defense of the place to which they were assigned. Naturally, this was feasible when the local threats were kind of low intensity in some ways, because these troops were not able, ever since they had been created, to stop by themselves entire armies, like the equivalents of what the Roman Comitatenses were, as such, right? So field armies. But for the rest, they had been faring pretty well. Here it seems, though, that the tendency is to lower the standards, right? The Limitanei are just like a police force, right? They're local militia, let's be honest about it. The gradual loss in professionalism of these soldiers, at least in those regions that were less exposed to hostile incursions, seem to be witnessed with clarity by some papyrus that come from Egypt, in fact, and are dated to the second half of the 6th century and the first one of the following, that were part of the family papers of Flavius Patermuthis, that was serving in a Limitanei unit that is in fact attested on the Egyptian frontier. And the activity of this Limitanus, that is indicated as such in 585 and still in service in 613, seems in fact to indicate that the double profession was a normal fact for the Egyptian Limitanei, at least. In numerous documents, Flavius Patermuthis is qualifying himself indifferently as soldier of the unit of Elephantine and boatman by profession, right? And at the same in the same way, his brother-in-law John, that was enlisted in 583, is indicated as soldier of the unit of Siena, originary of the same Siena, and boatman by profession. So this is very fascinating because it shows quite clearly how these people were simply doing other jobs, right, and serving as militia when that was needed, right. We don't know, I think, much about how they may even rotate this because it was normal even in more ancient times. The soldiers would have some sort of free time, but not a parallel job, right, if not within the same military administration. And so since the 6th century, we see this figure of the soldier colonist among the Limitanei that cultivated the lands obtained by the government as essentially the same compensation for the oath service, right? This is quite important because it's also a way to, if you territorialize these people, you're basically paying them with the same land, right, and what that produces without actually caring about the costs of supplying. That was an enormous problem, right? What we were talking about. I mean, the idea of putting together all these resources to eventually give it back to be used by people who could essentially get them on their own, right? Especially when they have this limited localistic employment, and yeah, I mean that's it. And after all, right, an armed militia in this regard existed in many other places, right? It's not just the Roman Empire; also other countries functioned essentially like this, right? It was a necessity of self-defense that went beyond the military prescription of the empire, right? It was normal to already have something like this, right? The important here, though, is that there's still part of units that are administratively and organically qualified as such, so that they have to respond even to potentially more intense military service in case of need. Of milites, that is, properly soldiers, only the mobile troops, the federati and the scholae, excluding the limitanei. So this is very interesting because it shows you that these troops weren't considered even like the military anymore, right? It's like today's police. It's not the military, right? It's depending on which country, I don't know. But the difference here is pretty remarkable because the status of miles, right, as such, entailed, all a series of prerogatives, also legally speaking, that were shared by troops that, for example, here even came from abroad, right, foreign mercenaries, were considered as soldiers proper, whereas the limitanei were not. So that this is very, very, meaningful as an evidence. So, in definitive, although the complete lack of effectiveness of the limitanei is perhaps too radical a hypothesis, in the course of the 6th century it's evident a less systematicity in their employment according to the originary mentions, which, however, were never abandoned in a definitive way, right? So this is essentially the picture that we want to draw, right? There is not a complete decay of the function of the strategical and tactical effectiveness of the limitanei that substantially had remained the same conceptually, right? It's just a decrease in certain areas where evidently their role could be, essentially just the one of local garrisoning, of local policing, right? And this is very meaningful when you look at the broader picture of the empire, right? It was too costly to maintain on the long run too numerous and vast fronts, even just. Given the available military resources that were running out, right? And this continuous work of diplomacy also together with the allies on the frontiers is very meaningful, right? There are lots of peoples that are increasingly settled here to form buffer states against foreign enemies. Look at the Ghassanids on the Arab frontier. So same Arabs were literally settled into Roman territory, even as immigrants proper. Like it wasn't like a real, local integration. It was simply lands that were left to them. And the same was being worked probably when Justinian was thinking of making the Longobards federati of the Romans in the Po Valley. Instead, things got out of hand. But there are many examples of this. Also because there were constantly peoples that weren't just seeking naturally for occupying territories, but simply to serve in the Roman army in other ways, right? If you look at the same Longobards, when the Romans were fighting against them in Italy, there were lots, but I mean lots of Longobards in the Byzantine army. We talk about thousands, even more, and that were, deployed in Armenia, right? We know thousands of Longobards brought there, right? And these are often things about which we don't have any better evidence than just like one source telling you randomly that had happened, right? But it was difficult at this point to manage the frontier proper as such. So even the recourse to diplomacy, for example, is something you have to understand. It was reflecting itself not on a static military organization. On the contrary, it was basically a political tool to compensate, in fact, where the military instrument was not equally convenient. Like the same reason of paying tributes to other peoples, right? Doesn't mean you're weak. It's simply you're making an assessment of costs benefits, and there were areas where the military was still very active because it was needed to be there, right? And unfortunately, we don't know that much, but it's obvious that at this point, the frenetic back and forth also of the military forces along the frontiers required a sort of specialization, mostly of the mobile armies as such. If you look at how the Byzantines reconquered the West, for example, they used very few troops. You look at Belisarius' armies, there were some thousand troops, like mostly mounted apparently. So even from a logistical point of view, at this point it was difficult to find the resources in the first place. So how do you maintain the Limitanei if you don't make them settle down, right? If you pretend that they have to remain the high military standard, there are no resources to do it anymore. So it's better for them just to be settling there and to work as a local militia. Most of the cases, when there is need, you station other troops somewhere else. For example, Africa saw the deployment of mobile troops, definitely, in addition to the local Limitanei, right? There was the necessity to back there, for example, a fairly medium-high threat from the Berbers that could effectively disrupt the fabric of African society and economics along the coast. And in other occasions, instead, the Limitanei could cooperate effectively and in continuity with the past habits with the Comitatenses, right, with the field army in those defensive or also offensive operations, like it happened, for example, in 530 during the Battle of Dara. For example, the army Per Orientem of Belisarius was supported on that occasion by the Limitanei of the Fenice Libanenses, right, and probably also of other districts of the area. And yeah, you put together all what you need, and don't think that in the previous centuries it was that different after all, right? It worked like that with auxiliary forces in early imperial times. Massive campaigns always needed to put together lots of resources, sometimes from very far away provinces, right, in order to maximize the results, because armies of 30,000 men begin to be something really massive to manage logistically at the time, right? Don't be fooled by numbers. There was nothing at the time that was possibly reaching 50,000, more than 50,000 troops. Not that in this specific time it happened, but when there are lots of people that don't know how to read resources, they think that simply since a number it's spoken right in a source, that's an actual source you can assess as realistic. It doesn't work like that, and we know pretty easily from the logistical standards of the ancient medieval world that there are certain limits you cannot surpass, right? Unless you're not coordinating vast forces on very wide strategic scenarios, but you still need too many resources most of the times, and you have to assess whether it was worth it. And that's also why one of the reasons why I think actually that Justinian reconquest was effective, because it actually happened with a lot of resources in relative terms, maybe too much, we don't know, also because we don't have the quantities in here. But if you look at the armies that performed that, like they reconquered the whole freaking Western Mediterranean, well, they were after all fairly limited, right? And the main losses happened not really in the way these troops were consuming in terms of normal supply lines. It was chiefly political and strategical mistakes in terms of how to manage certain theaters, even in situations like in Italy where the first invasion had been successful. Then basically everything crumbled, almost completely reversing, just because they mismanaged they switched the commanders, they left unguarded the situation. So it's the frontier question this time is very important, and the Limitanei are sometimes really especially the most peaceful areas, probably the best answer as police force. Then in other areas you have to necessarily intervene with field armies, or even settling entire peoples, hoping that they can counterbalance each other. And that's eventually what Constantinople will keep on doing for forever, as long as they had for most of their empire an international capacity of some sort. Okay, so yeah, I wanted to tell just this for today, and we may deepen the topic on another occasion, because I would like to start to talk more about the Byzantine Empire, and we'll have to start somewhere. And alright, so for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.